It's so vital to the life of the church and to our lives as individual followers of Jesus that we hold to the truth, that we preach the true gospel, that we teach sound doctrine. But as we hear in the words of Jesus to the church at Ephesus in Revelation 2, it's possible to be very serious about fighting for the truth with all your mind, yet not serious at all about loving God with all your heart. Because sound doctrine is meant to do much more than sound right. Because right doctrine is nothing without right living. We saw that in the past few weeks in 1 and 2 Timothy, and we see it again clearly in today's reading from the book of Titus. Paul begins in verse 1 by saying that the truth they are fighting for, the truth they are holding to, is the truth according to godliness. In other words, to the truth which actually leads to godly living. The rest of chapter 1 is dealing with the qualifications for elders in the church. And he says in verse 9 that one of the important qualifications, which unfortunately we seem to ignore a lot of times when we choose leaders in the church, is that they must be able to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict sound doctrine. But he's not just talking about a battle between true teaching and false teaching. The evidence on both sides, whether true or false, Paul says, is seen in how they live. He shows first that elders must be qualified by the way that they live their lives, in the eyes of the church and in the eyes of the community around them, in their character, in the way that they relate with others, in the way that they lead their families. And the false teachers, he says in verses 10 to 16, prove that they don't know God not because of their wrong teaching, but because of their wrong actions. So in chapter 2, he says to Titus and to us, speak the things which are fitting to sound doctrine. And then he goes on and shows what is fitting to sound doctrine, that it's not seen in what we say, it's seen in how we live, the kind of life that ought to accompany sound doctrine. In all things, he says in verse 7, show yourself to be an example of good deeds along with purity and doctrine. Paul is saying over and over that it is our Christ-like lives, not our perfect arguments, that silence our opponents. Because when we live the truth, they've got nothing left to argue about. When we live Christ-like lives, he says in verse 10, it makes the doctrine of God look beautiful. And right at the end of chapter 2 then is the key passage that captures the message of Titus. He says in verse 11 that the grace of God has appeared to all men, bringing salvation. And what does that saving grace do? We often preach that all it does is save us from the penalty of our sin. But Paul says it does so much more. Verse 12, he says this grace instructs us to deny ungodliness and to live righteously, sensibly, and godly in this present age. He says in verse 14 that Jesus gave his life for us in order to redeem us from every sinful deed and to purify for himself a people who is zealous for good deeds. And Paul makes it clear in chapter 3 that he's not introducing a new law from Jesus that says, do this and don't do that if you want to be right with God. He says in verses 4 to 6 that we are saved only by the mercy and grace of God, and that we are able to live Christ-like lives full of good deeds only because of the cleansing and empowering work of the Holy Spirit within us. And he concludes in verse 8 by saying that for people who really believe the truth, for people who really put their trust in the mercy of God, who really surrender themselves to the work of his Spirit, those people, he says, will be people whose lives are filled with good deeds that point others to Christ. We're not saved because we do good deeds. We do good deeds because we're saved. And people aren't convinced of the truth when they hear it so accurately from our mouths. People are convinced of the truth when they see it clearly in our lives.